Nigeria's federal government, through the CEO of the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, has stated that it is considering selling stakes in about 20 state-run companies to raise funds and improve governance. And this is according to a Bloomberg report. Among these, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited is a potential candidate. The move aims to inject private sector vitality and create value rather than just retaining control. The plan aligns with President Bola Tinubu's economic reform strategy and will involve expert consultants. Here in Lagos, Nigeria, I have Abiodun Kayode Ali, is the senior manager at PwC Nigeria, and is going to be talking to us this morning. Thank you so much, Abiodun, for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me, Lagos.
All right, this is not the first time that the Nigerian government has tinkered with the idea of selling some national assets. Dates back to about 2016. So is it about time to get this done in terms of sales of these national assets to raise revenue or to raise cash?
Okay, like you rightly said, at this point in time, Nigeria is actually going through a lot, given some of the challenges it's facing, especially with respect to dwindling revenue, which is sourced majorly from our oil assets, right, production of oil. So given the circumstances that the current government is in with respect to the high cost of living, given the two significant policies that have been made, removal of subsidy, as well as the unification of exchange rates, right? So the hardship of people, the government is trying to solve it as much as it can. Recently our inflation rate is quite high, somewhere within the range of 24%, right? And most of our inflation are actually coming from imported inflation. So given the need to raise revenue, right, the government is simply thinking about this policy. Now, with respect to the timing, like you asked, I think the right time to have done this would have been years ago, but like they say, the next best time to do such thing is now. So the earlier the government does it, the better. And it does make a lot of sense, given the fact that a lot of these assets are underperforming. Still on that statement made by the minister, by the CEO of the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, a lot of assets that the government has been underperforming, all right, despite the amount of money that has been pumped into it. And we can list several examples here, right? Lots of assets that the government has held on to that are not producing much. Do you want to talk about the refineries, which hasn't produced oil for a very long time, despite the voluminous investment that has gone into it, even to the extent whereby the private refinery that is being built by Alhaji Aliko Dangote, it's been said that an equivalent amount has gone into revamping those refineries that we have, the one in Kaduna, the one in Warri, but yet all the same, they've not been producing. So given all what we are seeing, the reality of things and the market mind of the current government, it does make a lot of sense to sell assets that are not helping Nigeria in any way.
All right, it's understandable that there are some of these companies that are said to have gone moribund. Some are said to be underperforming and not generating revenue for the government while the workers are being paid. But since the news got out, there have been this argument about if the government should sell these assets outrightly or sell stakes so that it can have a bit of control. So which one would you go for and why?
Okay, so I think one thing that is important when it comes to asset sale, because a lot of stakeholder interests are involved here, right? So in my own opinion, I think you need to look at these assets one-on-one, right? You need to look at them individually. And some of the considerations you would want to make would be how have they been managed in the past? What's their profitability? Have they been yielding results? Then also, what is their relevance, right? Relevance to the entire stakeholder. In Nigeria, currently, we have the rich and we have the poor. There is no middle class. The middle class has totally been taken out of the way, right? So when you are selling these assets, you want to look at some of the assets that serve the interest of all Nigerians, right? So you want to look at the assets like the refineries. I think it would be in the best interest to simply sell them rather than borrow money to continue to refurbish them, right? Then also, the CBN as well as the Bankers Committee, they made a good move to revamp some national assets like the National Theatre in Igomu, right? I think it was a recent it was recently that it was handed over to the bankers committee. So there are other assets like that, but there are some assets that are of vital interest to everyone, right? Is it things like health, things like education? So at that instance, it probably government still needs to hold on to it to some extent, because you don't want a situation whereby the private sector would want to monopolize it, or want to treat it in such a way that it's no longer accessible, right? No longer accessible to the average man, right? So I think in these areas, yes, you might want to consider government still having involvement, but to a large extent, because most of these government assets, they require huge maintenance costs. And in Nigeria, the cost government is not quite good when it comes to maintenance. I don't know if you've recently been to the airport, the old terminal at the Murtala Mohammed International Airport. It's not something that is quite pleasing, right? It's not something you want to be proud of. And this is actually the gateway into the country, right? So assets such as these, I think it's a good idea to concession them, right? Have the private sector come and work hand in hand with the with governments, right? And if you consider the government's National Development Plan, which is from 2021 to 2025, we're almost in the middle of this National Development Plan. The government wants to make investments that are worth about 350 trillion naira, right? It's a lot of money. So most of these assets, right, like the national airport, which I just spoke about, a concession would make perfect sense, right? Because the government does not have the resources, especially given these times that government is struggling with a huge deficit for the 2023 budget, which is around 12 trillion, right? And the government is also trying to create palliatives, right? Intervention measures to cushion the effect of the subsidy removal at this point in time. So I think for assets such as the ones that are quite key, such as power, power and electricity, such as health, I think the government can decide to hold on to some of them. But for other assets that are things of national pride, right, I think the government might want to run it alongside the private sector, especially those ones that are currently that are in need of refurbishment at this point in time. So those are my thoughts.
All right, let's consider what the CEO of the Ministry of Finance, that is Armstrong Takang, said. He noted that some of the entities need the private sector to take controlling shares, and that the major consideration for the government is to create value rather than retain control. But then isn't that tantamount to selling off one's birthright for money, and at the end losing substantial accruals that should come to government? Because you also stress the issue of accessibility, and some other people are also concerned about the posture of these assets that might not be sold, but then could have some shares being shared between the government and the private sector. So you want to consider the percentage at which the government will want to take, and of course what will go to the private sector in terms of handling and management, and how the government will benefit and not lose the overall position or vision of these particular national assets.
Yeah, you're quite right, and his comment was spot on. I mean, you just think about it. There are other assets that the federal government has actually concessioned that are doing quite well. A very good example, which most associations and even not too recently, the Petroleum and Natural Gas Association, Senior Staff Association have said is the NLNG model, right? If you look at the NLNG model, right, it's also an asset of the federal government. The government owns about 49% stake in it, right? And NLNG is one of those assets that is actually doing quite well. In terms of our revenue, most of the dividend that the Nigerian government is getting is actually coming from NLNG, right? So if you can adopt that model to a lot of these assets, right? NNPC Limited, for instance, even though it's said to be owned by every Nigerian, you still have a situation whereby the majority shares are still being controlled by the government, right? It is expected that this year, probably before the end of this year. It's going to be listed right on the Nigerian Stock Exchange and also on the International Stock Exchange. But I think one thing that is quite key is that if we adopt the model that we said, right, whereby the government reduces the stake. So in terms of percentage, somewhere around 40% for the government makes a lot of sense. And with that, the government can still provide oversight function, right? It still boils out to the point of these are national assets. Yes, agreed, right? And if you want to consider the interest of everyone, right, you want to avoid a situation whereby the private sector is probably not dealing with it like a national asset, but dealing with it more like a private asset. By national asset, if you think about it, it's providing employment to a lot of people. It's providing services to a lot of people, right? By the time you privatize some of these things totally, yes, you do agree that some people might lose their employment status, right? So I think government can back down to a reasonable extent to something like probably 40%. That makes a lot of sense, right? And like you rightly said, there are instances whereby the government has totally brought in the private sector and the private sector has not made good use of such opportunities. A very good example is, I don't know if you remember in Lagos State, there was a particular point in time when private sector had to be involved in collection of waste and refuse dump. And if you consider the demand, right, the private sector was not able to meet the demand and it was making Lagos dirty at the point in time. So I think key assets that are actually of national interest, right? There should be a kind of on a case-by-case basis, there should be a kind of analysis. You weigh the benefits as well as the cost, and also the involvement of the private sector. Can they meet such things, right? With respect to the technology needed at that point in time, and with respect to capacity, right? So in my own position or for my own take, I will believe that if government is involving itself in certain assets in which it does have to still remain in place, right? Maybe to provide oversight function, somewhere within the range of 40% would make sense. And the NLNG model is a very good example.
All right, so we have got to the part that is most important for the ordinary Nigerian. Now, this is what the government said, that it is aiming to improve governance, to generate funds for socio-economic development, and to contribute to the overall welfare and prosperity of the nation through asset sales. So, judging by the antecedents of past administrations, as beneficial as they may be, how feasible are these lofty plans?
Yeah, so true. The most important thing has to do with revenue is important, right? But vis-a-vis, you have to look at other objectives, right? So apart from revenue, it's also the point of being able to service society, right? So looking at past sales that have actually transpired, especially with trust, if you look at the power sector, right? The generation stage, the generation value chain, as well as distribution. Yes, the distribution value chain, both have been prioritized, but there is still the transmission, right? So the transmission sometimes can serve as a clog in the wheel. So to some extent, there are still issues around the power sector that need to be studied. I'm sure you remember last year at the point in time, there was a situation whereby there were employees from the transmission company. They had to shut down the power at a particular point in time, leading to a total blackout. So I think it's quite important that there needs to be a thorough analysis of each of these assets and what they represent as far as national interest is concerned. So I think once you consider all these things, the government will be able to come up with a decision. But one thing that is very important is that the government will probably need to have stakeholder meetings, right? So not just government making a decision on its own. Government would have to sit down with stakeholders. The people also as well must be involved. The employees, right? The employees in these areas, they also need to be involved. The private sector, fine, can be more efficient in doing these things, and efficiency is what we need right now. But like we've said, that stakeholder meeting is quite key. With respect to past assets that have been sold, it might be up to the government and even people need to call on government to do a kind of audit on the performances of those sales that have been made, because without auditing or examining the past performances, we won't be able to tell what to do going forward. So I think that audit is actually quite key, right? Looking back at what we've done and seeing how we can take things forward. I think that's quite key. So despite the fact that the government is in serious need of revenue right now, it still needs to look at national interest, have a stakeholder meeting, and carry out audits on past sales. I think that's quite key.
All right, so there's another conversation that I'd like you to look at, especially when it comes to the issue of accountability, transparency, and of course ensuring that there is no corruption in the processes of transiting from a private from assets that actually belong to the government being given to the private sector to manage. So, what strategies would you recommend, and how do you think that the government can ensure accountability when it comes to privatizing or probably selling the stakes of these assets?
Yeah, thanks for that question, which is quite spot on. Transparency is one thing that is key, all right? Because if the government is holding these assets in place of the people, all right, it's quite important that the people are aware of everything that is going on. And like we've said, in the past, we've seen situations whereby government is actually, to some extent, we've heard of situations of politics being involved when it comes to transferring these assets, right? We've heard of situations whereby we don't even the National Assembly, right? State assemblies were not even aware of some of the contracts that were given, all right? So I think it's quite key transparency. And when I talk of transparency, it's important that government actually publishes most of this information, right? It's available on the media, right? Allowing journalists, allowing news agencies to be able to have access to this information and also send them out to the public. So I think that form of transparency is quite important. The stakeholder engagement is also something that I think is quite key, right? So prior to these contracts being given to the private sector, it's quite important that there is an announcement of the timelines, right? And there is also that examination that is being done on the usefulness. So these are the ways that government can actually carry out that transparency and stakeholder meeting. As long as the objectives are clear and as long as government is willing to always share information, I think this will go a long way. Then I'll also call on the State House of Assembly and the National Assembly. I think they also have a major role because it seems, based on revelations that have been coming out recently, that they are sometimes not carried along and the executive is actually carrying out a lot of these actions, right? So if government, both at the executive and also at the legislative arm, if government are meant to hold most of these things in place for the people, it's quite important that they also carry the people along and they carry each other along. So I think these are some of the measures that can be taken.
All right, so finally, Abiodun, this where it becomes sensitive because we've talked about some other performance of these assets, and that is why they might be sold or stakes being sold to other private individuals or entities, as the case may be. But now, if we have an underperformance of these entities after sales have been done, probably in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, we discover that these national assets are not really churning out the figures or performing optimally. So what are the available options on the table?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So sometimes things might not happen as we actually expected or anticipated them to go. So I think some of the things that might want to be done is, first of all, there should be an audit, right? What exactly went wrong? Could it be as a result of the terms that were in the contracts that was signed between the government and the private stakeholders that were involved, right? So it's important that we look at the terms of contract and we also carry out an audit on exactly what could have gone wrong. And if it's a situation whereby there was probably it had to do with regulations, there's probably non-compliance, either on the side of the private sector, on the side of the government, it's important that penalties should actually come up, right? If the private sector has actually not been managing it as it ought to have managed it, there should be penalties, right? And if you have to cancel such contracts, yes, why not? There should be avenues to cancel such contracts and probably reconsider, should government actually take it back or should government probably contract it out to someone else? So I think these are some of the considerations you might want to look at. But at every stage, by the time that contract is being signed by the private sector, there should be a kind of stage, a kind of one should be able to look at the stages, right? The number of years you are concessioning it. If it's a PPP arrangement, is it achieving its target? Is it achieving its objective? And there should always be consideration for cancellation if any of these things happen. So these are some of my thoughts on alternatives that can be taken in the event where this arrangement doesn't work.
All right, Abiodun Kayode Ali, Senior Manager at PwC Nigeria. Thank you for lending your voice to this discuss.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Leko.
All right.